So I'm going to just officially start us off and welcome everyone to our session titled Wicked Societal Problems, Challenge Our Collective Future, a conversation on the role of negotiation and conflict management frameworks in moving towards solutions. We're really excited to be able to have this roundtable conversation at ICM with the backgrounds and diversity of professional angles that we bring to the table. And what we're going to do today is have Josh launch us off with a brief introduction that'll include definitions, and then go around our roundtable that you will have to imagine. But we have a Google document that the discussants are seeing in the background, the one advantage of a virtual conference that we can have multiple screens open. And so they're going to nod to one another and transition from one another. And then when we go through and cycle through, I'll be the final speaker, and we'll open it up to questions and integrative brainstorming with everyone who's joined us today. So Josh, I'm going to turn it to you, and I'm going to share in the chat the list of discussants in alphabetical order so that everyone can see who's the discussant.
Great. Well, thanks, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to see everybody, at least virtually. I'll keep my remarks very short, and instead of concrete definitions that we need to hold ourselves to, I'll just give some conceptual ideas around wicked problems and complex systems to sort of orient the discussion. I've had discussions with many of the participants in this Zoom call at other IACM conferences around some of the technical aspects of complex systems, wicked problems, etc. So we'll just keep this to a short sort of framing discussion, maybe. So in terms of the framing for the discussion, I wanted to hit 3 points. Our business and sustainability challenges, i.e. our societal problems, involve complicated and complex system dynamics, both at the same time. In that context, then, collaborative planning and learning is key to being able to address wicked problems. But the strategies that we use to address wicked problems, as opposed to more Newtonian or straightforward problems, are novel for most businesses. So the questions we're exploring are, how do we work with businesses to enable them to uptake some strategies for addressing wicked problems? So to begin with a few definitions, most people, I'm sure, have seen this schematic that lays out the different types of systems and their dynamics. Ranging from very simple, like a very basic arithmetic problem, all the way to chaotic, where there's just no predictability in the system. The world exhibits all 4 types of systems, but most of the dynamics that we encounter in our day-to-day life, and our professional life, and our business lives fall into either the complicated or the complex categories. Complicated systems are predictable, but they're complicated. They involve many moving pieces, many interconnected components, but the boundaries and the limits of any problem in a system, a complicated system, are clear. The problems are well understood and commonly understood by all the stakeholders. The problem and the solution behave in predictable ways, and that leads to there being a finite set of solutions. So I have this problem, I have a set that ranges from 1 to 100 of possible solutions. I'm going to choose the best solution based on what's most efficient, cost effective, etc. The idea, though, is that I understand if I kick the ball, it will probably hit the goal. A complex system is different. In a complex system, there are a lot of moving pieces, a lot of interconnectivity. The difference, though, is there's not the same sort of linear cause and effect relationship. That means that the system behaves unpredictably. We can understand what happened retrospectively by understanding the components, how they interacted, what happened, and what manifested, but we can't say with certainty, if I do this, it will result in X. What I can say is, if I do this, there's a probability it will land between X and Y somewhere. And importantly, the boundaries of the problem, the boundaries of the system aren't clear, and they're not commonly understood. Pardon me. And so in that context, then, there's an infinite number of problems based on the number of stakeholders' actions. It's sort of a logarithmic expansion of the problem space and the solution space. And so in my research center at Columbia, we use the metaphor of complex systems as well as the mathematical properties of complex systems to understand how to intervene and how to interact with stakeholders facing conflicts. And the jargon of complex systems is everywhere today, but it does have these specific properties of interconnectivity, nonlinearity, multi-causality, and constant change. And those result in a system in which a change in this corner of the system ripples across that entire network and manifests in seemingly distant or poorly connected aspects or corners of the system. This all means that the problems we encounter are really difficult, i.e. wicked. Wicked not in the sense of morally corrupt or morally wrong, but wicked in terms of being intractable, challenging, difficult to resolve. And that's because every actor in the system defines the problem differently. So for me, a given problem is an economic problem. For you, it's a business problem. For you, it's a rule of law problem. And so we're all facing the same issue, but the problem is unique to me, my needs, interests, value systems, etc. And so that social complexity adds to the infinite number of problems that we're facing and dealing with, and problem solution spaces that we're trying to engage in. Moreover, the sort of multi-causality and non-linearity means that the system itself is constantly evolving. And as I interact with you in the system to try and meet my needs or solve my problem, the nature of the problem itself changes for you. So I've just instigated a change that now, whereas you saw it initially as a problem of a business decision, now it's one of real value conflict for you. So the system takes on this sort of evolving nature that leads to an ever-increasing instigation of new problems. And so in this way, wicked problems are never ending. That means that wicked problems aren't solved, but rather they're resolved over and over and over again. So if we understand that both things are happening at the same time, some problems are linear, some problems do exhibit this sort of complicated but predictable pattern, others this complex pattern, and everything's nested in this complex system. The question is, how do we address them? Well, a complicated, predictable problem, we can use traditional tools like cost-benefit analysis, strategic planning, coordinated action among stakeholders or partners, and we can use performance-based metrics to try and learn and improve our performance in the problem solution space. Complex problems are different though because of this nonlinearity, this evolving nature and ever self-instigating nature of the solution space and the problem space. This means that before we even try and solve a problem or address a problem, we need to come together to collectively define the problem. So we need to agree what we will work on, what we won't work on. And this then requires, if we can come up with, this is how we all see the problem, then we have to build a theory around what could possibly enable us to each meet our needs and interests without compromising those of each other or stepping on each other's value systems. And so we have to approach that through theory building and hypothesis testing rather than strategic planning. And the self-instigating nature of these problems means that we're constantly adapting to new problems, new changes. So we have to be in this perpetual system of adaptive action, adaptive management. And that requires a type of learning that's deliberative, not performance-based. By deliberative, I mean we have to actually come together and talk about what a change is doing to you and your needs and your interests and your value and your business case, and me the same. So we have to be in this ever-evolving conversation around problem solving, hypothesis testing, refinement. And so it's a very different approach to problem solving than the sort of Newtonian or linear approach that we use in complicated problems. So businesses are used to addressing complicated problems. It's a little more complex to work in the complex problem space because you do have the reality of a lot of your actions do exhibit this complicated nature, not the complex nature. And you're responding on sort of quarterly or annual time horizons that don't really lend themselves to the sort of evolving nature of a complex problem. So how do we enable companies and corporations and governments to work in both spaces simultaneously. That's the discussion I think we should focus on today. And so that's really my sort of framing, and I'm happy to take heat for anything you all disagree with. But I'll turn it over to Morten to introduce our first discussion topic.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. And sorry for my ubication. I'm sitting in a cafe. I was just called in for my second vaccination. So I'm on the road sitting in a cafe here. So sorry if there's any noise here around me. So the story I'm going to share today is about making the business case. And first I'd like to say it's an honor and pleasure to be part of this roundtable. Looking at the discussants, I still think I got the invitation by mistake, but now I'm here, so you can't get rid of me. And I'd like to talk about the strategy, the sustainability strategy of Vestas, which is from sustainability in everything in the business we are in to sustainability in everything we do. And what I'm about to share is, in my mind, a fresh, inspiring, and promising example of how a financially driven large company have made public commitments, investments, and already taking actions that goes far beyond greenwashing. And the implications, as I see them, are far-reaching, as this business case should, according to the traditional financial metrics, never have been approved. So why did the executives and the board of this listed company approve the strategy on behalf of its almost 30,000 employees? And making a handful in informal interviews, we found 5 related whys for this decision. 4 of them we found were linked to external motivators and 3 to internal motivators. And the external motivators was coming from customer demand. We were seeing that the customers identified as the winners of the future were really setting standards much higher for sustainability than on other customers. Likewise for the investors, a growing part of the investors, a third today, they operate under what's called responsible investment mandates. And in both cases, this new strategy for Vestas would actually meet and exceed the standards required by these 2 segments. Furthermore, employees are more and more purpose-driven, as we all know, and this strategy would really be key to meet the current and future employees' expectations. Last but not least, compliance. There is an emerging global legislation that is really where we're expecting to see increased incentives, both carrots and sticks, in favor of sustainability. But what the story I'm telling you here is from 2020, late 1920. So still, it wasn't as good as environment as we're in currently. And when we look at the internal motivators, so why did these executives actually go for this? The board and the executive management had already approved a strategy called a leader in sustainable energy. And the approval of this strategy was very consistent with their previous decision. And for them, according to themselves, it was really very much felt like co-creation that was being done, and kind of a necessary next step. We built a very concrete plan with 6 projects where the goals were clearly monetized, which is hard in these cases to do. But the big difference is that the IRR, so the expected rate of return for these projects, was much lower than we currently see in business. And there were made some very, very big assumptions. We're actually embarking and committing to things that we have no clue how to solve it. But looking into the identity of the company, we've done it before. We've made this leap of faith. So that was one of the important outcomes. And the last point here I want to mention is that the CEO we see, it's a new CEO who launched this, a former member of the board, but new as a CEO. He is very motivated by this beyond the financials. For what reasons, this is still unclear, but he has a strong motivation here. So in summary, I think that we all know that climate change is the mother of all externalities, and incentives are necessary to drive this climate change mitigation and adaptation. But still, companies can and should do more. And I think this example is a good example of one company that actually have done more. And I hope this concrete example can serve as inspiration for our discussion. So with this, thank you everyone. I think that was more than my 3 minutes, and I'll hand the baton over to Will.
Thanks, Morten. And I observe, Morten, since you and I met in Istanbul in 2011, I think this is the first time we've shown up on the same panel. So it's great to be with you here, as well as everyone else. So I'm coming to you from my office, actually, in Arlington, Virginia. I need to say up front, this is my individual view and does not necessarily reflect the view of the US federal government, my employer. I wanted to say three things or talk about 3 points to key off what Morten said a little bit on companies and their potential interest in taking on wicked problems in a more effective way. A few thoughts as a collaboration and conflict resolution practitioner. As you all know, I kind of wear both hats in the practitioner side and the academic side. And then want to say a few words about the idea of wicked problems as contagions, as contagious problems. It's with a little help from science fiction. So I don't know if Noam is here or not, but I know he would appreciate that if he is. So with respect to companies, I guess I would say from the vantage point of government, at least, seems like they should have a long-term perspective and have an interest in a long-term perspective on some of these issues that are going to take longer. Two things about that. One is, I would think that businesses would favor order instead of chaos. And a lot of the wicked problems that we could name definitely lean towards the more, as it's been said, complex or chaotic direction. Having a reliable business environment, including supply chains that work. If nothing else, this past couple of years now with the COVID situation, we've seen how supply chains can be disrupted and businesses don't get what they need in order to do the products and services they provide. I think there's also a case to be made for equity, which is a wicked problem in our world today, and having customers that actually can afford the goods and services that businesses want to sell. So those are my quick thoughts about companies. As a practitioner, in some ways, I think a collaboration and conflict practitioner's perspective fits well in thinking about wicked problems. Josh had mentioned the idea that solutions or answers, maybe not solutions, come from a deliberative process. And that's what we do in this business, is help people have conversations to discuss worldviews and influence worldviews sometimes. We also focus on interventions rather than solutions. I don't think there's a solution to a lot of the wicked problems that we could name. But we can do interventions that potentially change the course of certain aspects of these problems. Similarly, in the same spirit of not having solutions, I think there can be really only better or worse outcomes that we might seek. And as practitioners, of course, we try not to get into the judgment around whether something is good or bad, but we try to help people improve the situation. A few sort of words that come to my mind as a practitioner as I think about these issues. I start with humility. Like Morten, I'm not sure I'm here that I have any great answers to these particular issues that we're talking about. I think we have to start from a place of humbleness and thinking about wicked problems, but also from a place of hope. And sometimes that means not naming these issues as wicked problems or intractable problems. That does not give the people we work with a tremendous amount of hope, and instead helping them focus on a vision of how things can be better. This means, of course, taking the long view and having patience and building our own resilience as practitioners, something that me and my team are working on a lot these days. And lastly, as a practitioner, I'd mention the opportunities of local engagement. Many of these issues are big, they're global in scope. And I think really to take them on, it's got to be in a way everyone's problem. Since we're talking about changing mindsets and behaviors, a great number of people need to change. So to the extent that some of these problems can be made more local, I think that helps. And as practitioners, that's where we work most of the time, is at that local level. The last point I'd make is about wicked problems as a contagion or as contagious. And I'm going to use some ideas that I'm playing with from a science fiction author, actually, a climate fiction author by the name of Kim Stanley Robinson. Maybe some of you know Mr. Robinson, Dr. Robinson, I should say. In his book, his recent book, Ministry for the Future, just came out a couple years ago, he says, wicked problems, in the technical sense of the term, are problems that can not only be solved, but dragged other situations down into them. They were, in effect, contagious. And I think that's an important aspect of wicked problems. And what I think that means is that there's an opportunity to intervene at the intersection of some of these problems. So for example, on climate change, the food, energy, water nexus, each of those problems for our world is an issue. Providing enough food, having enough energy, and of course, clean water for all. Those things come together, and I think there's some opportunities that, in fact, some companies have seized upon because they realize their interests are in all those areas. Perhaps also the intersection of indigenous knowledge and climate change for adaptability is another place, I think, where these wicked problems might intersect. And then lastly, from Robinson's book, he attributes a quote to Walter Benjamin, a German philosopher. I don't know Benjamin's work very much, but the motto that this Ministry of the Future uses in part of the book is overcome difficulties by multiplying them. And it made me think a bit about COVID-19 and the pandemic as a difficulty multiplier. Not that I'm recommending this as a desirable thing. Let me be clear. No one likes the pandemic. Many people have died. It's all bad in a lot of ways. But it does show some interesting things about how some of these wicked problems were highlighted a bit in a different way because of the pandemic. Think that cities in India can now see the Himalayas that they could not see before because of pollution, right? Two wicked problems intersecting. Or Black Lives Matter in the United States and perhaps around the world. Equity issues came to the fore in a way that maybe they wouldn't have absent this other difficulty. And lastly, perhaps changes in the labor market leading to greater equality because people are unwilling to work the same way that they have, the same jobs that they have, and now they want to telework from home instead of going into the office. So I'll stop there and just suggest this idea of wicked problems as a contagion. It's a problem, but there may also be embedded in that some opportunities. And I'll stop there, and I think I'm turning it over to Sonia next.
Yes, thank you very much, William. My name is Sonia Rauschitz. I am a friendly hello from Vienna. It's afternoon here, and very interesting to be part of this roundtable. This is my first time, so I hope I'm able to contribute a seat that helps us all to further our discussion. I'm a negotiation practitioner. So when we come to negotiations, what we look at is how people collaborate, how people work together. So, and when you talk about complicated problems, I think you distinguish between complex and complicated problems. I experience a lot of complex problems with business organizations. And usually what we do before we strategize is we diagnose. We diagnose what are some of the causes that we actually want to work on. What are some of the causes that we actually can intervene? And looking at these different sides where one can intervene, we distinguish three sides. And one of them is clearly you want to have great outcomes. And as you mentioned, COVID, there was something very interesting to see. When we work with our organizations, we often have this argument about how positional do you become and how collaborative and how assertive do you need to be. And all of a sudden, as the pandemic hits us, many people started to cooperate, just to work together. The issues were so complex, so people just started working together. And so that's one thing that was very interesting to see when we look at the outcome side. But what we also look at is the people side and the process that serves the people and the process that serves the good outcomes. And when we look at the people side, you know, we did some interviews 2 or 3 years ago, professional negotiators, and we said, what are you doing when things get difficult? And about 80% of the professional negotiators interviewed said, we either pause or we give in. Now, when we talk about complex issues, that's not a good approach. We want all of our expertise to work together and to cooperate. So one of the things that we focus on here in Vienna is actually how to make sure that people are agile, that people have all their talents available, that they find a process where they can cooperate. Even though it's difficult, even though they don't trust, even though people come from different expertise. But how do you stay agile? And in a way you can call it okay with each other. Can we be different, but still be curious? You know, how do we connect on the one hand, but how do we work together, think together, and how accountable are we then? And how do we keep each other accountable? So when we look at that, it's more looking at the agility of people, and the agility of people includes being okay with yourself, being agile, having your talents available. And I'm just throwing this in because you all bring different expertise, but just as one point, that's one of the things we're looking at, because at the end of the day, it's people who make the difference. It's people who cooperate. And if people cannot think straight, feel straight, you know, cannot connect with each other, cannot think with each other, are not holding each other accountable, there's no way forward. So that's one of the things I wanted to add. And this was already part of practice and lessons learned. So I'm passing on, I believe, to Matt, right?
So it's actually a great lead up, Sonia. Thank you. Because you talk about agility, and agility of the mind is really about creativity. But creativity is not just about, ooh, let's think of crazy new stuff. It's actually about figuring out ways that work to improve things, but that we cannot yet envision or imagine. And there's two really important parts of this. The first is that with respect to the problems that we're calling wicked, or whatever you want to call them, we have to acknowledge that that's a function of how we're thinking. It's not a function of the universe, right? If I were to say to you, hey, you should make this guitar sound fat when you record it, if you're not a musician, you probably don't know what the hell I'm talking about, right? So that seems like a strange and impossible problem. If you're an experienced studio engineer, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And so it's actually a fairly simple, straightforward problem. However, even if you are an experienced studio musician, that doesn't mean you know the best answer. And when people invent other answers to make the guitar sound fat by recording it in unique and new ways, it suddenly changes the problem from a well-structured one, do it this way, to an ill-structured one. Maybe we should think about recording multiple guitars with different tunings and different strings. You could have a more accessible option with saying, I imagine when people said, one day man will fly, or people will fly, right? That seemed like a pretty crazy idea, but it became something that we could learn how to do by taking the complexity and trying to reduce and understand it, which requires three kinds of thinking. This is the second thing I wanted to talk about. I always say you sort of have in your brain three functions. You have an artist, that is what we typically think about with creativity, who wants to come up with something that does not yet exist. You have a scientist who wants to understand how the world actually works. That is what we all do as researchers in order to make predictions that will come true. But you also have a judge, and that judge wants to determine what is good and what is bad in a sort of moralistic social sense. Creativity is not just about the artist, it's about all three. Creativity is about sort of having an artist imagine things that the scientist can actually get to work and that are beneficial to society, hence the judge. This is exactly sort of what Sonia was just talking about, right? When people are negotiating, what you want to be able to do is sort of say, what is the nature of this problem and how can we actually solve it, right? And you don't want people to shut down others or sort of close their mind. And the challenge is that our judge does that. Our judge is kind of the oldest function we have, because before we could speak, we would needed to understand what threats were and get away from them and what was good and go towards that. But the problem is that we, especially in these kinds of problems, the minute we bring those things up, the shoulds come in and say, okay, and they can kind of shut things down. So I'll give you a simple example. You know, when COVID hit, my child had to go online for school, and I live in a very well-off, it's Fairfax. We have plenty of resources, but we still have a lot of variety and disparity in terms of income. And so not everyone had the same amount of access. Their response was, since everyone doesn't have the same access, and that's not fair, no one gets nothing. So we had a month where no one was educated, no kids were managed, nothing, because that shut people down, because nobody wanted to say, hey, listen, that's a terrible idea. I know it's unfair, but we got to work around this. And by the way, it's not that that couldn't be done, because Loudoun County, which has no resources, was online the next week. So what I wanted to say is that when we think about changing our perspectives, which is really what creativity is, and also why Cindy is perfect for me to talk right after this, that requires getting our judge function out of the way. Sort of instead of saying, all right, well, wait a minute, how is that going to benefit? Who's that going to hurt? Who's that going to benefit? In a way, we sort of have to put that off until later, and just until we can figure out, okay, but what is possible even in the first place? And that's really challenging, especially in the heat of the moment, which we all know as negotiation researchers. I actually think fondly back to when I actually first met Moti, which was years ago, where he talked about getting, people, the Palestinians and the Israelis, just to have a way to clarify what the hell is going on. Never mind, right, like what should be done. Just can we even talk about it as such an essential first step? And that's stayed with me since then. So that's the thing that I sort of want to get us to talk about, which is how do we get our well-intentioned but problematic judge out of the way as we move forward and try to change our perspective. And with that, I turn it over to Cynthia.
All right, thank you very much. So very interesting conversations. As Matt mentioned, I definitely am interested in just intergroup dynamics, similar to what Sonia was talking about. How can you stay agile, cooperate, and really connect when you have very different perspectives? And I'm going to talk a little bit about two areas of work that I've done because I think it's relevant to the discussions that we're having, particularly the question of how do we avoid the limits of responsive action in the workplace when we're really trying to address these difficult and wicked problems. So one area of research that I've really gotten interested in is social movements, actually. I have some colleagues here at Northwestern that have studied social movements. And of course, very salient in my mind was the recent movements of Black Lives Matter and even the Me Too movement of a couple of years ago. And one thing about trying to understand cooperation in social movements is that activists really want to try to win over potential supporters, really secure these allies. But a difficult thing, a challenge is how movements can really gain allies and make policy changes within organizations. There's a whole different set of dynamics you have to consider in terms of actually making change within these organizations. So what we started trying to understand is how the labels and discourse used to introduce certain potential policies related to these social movements within organizations, how does that affect ally mobilization? How can we get more buy-in for these types of changes? So in one of the papers that I did was that we basically specifically examined labels related to the women's rights movements, such as feminists, Me Too, and also really looked at organizationally related labels to understand the recruitment process and the support for these gender equity policies that were being talked about within these organizations. And one of the big limits to the responsive action was actually the congruence between the identities of the individuals and the labels. What we showed was that those that were high in feminist identification were more likely to support feminist labeled policies, like policies that say, hey, this is a Me Too oriented policy, and that instigated change. But of course, those that were lower in feminist identification, they didn't like those feminist labeled policies and were more accepting of unlabeled policies. Now, we were also able to show that we could garner support by those low in feminist identification by prompting organizational identification. So what this really shows is the importance of understanding the discourse when trying to address these challenging problems, understanding your audience in order to help the collaboration and creativity in terms of how to essentially gain movement and gain tractions for these policies that are very difficult to change. Now, as Matt mentioned, my other big area of research is perspective taking. And what I've really gotten interested in is perspective taking from the minority perspective. We often focus on how do we change what is perspective taking like from the majority perspective? It reduces stereotyping of minority members, et cetera. But let's get into the psychology of minority members. Another thing that I've been interested in is authenticity climates, so understanding the climates of organization. And a huge challenge for organizations is understanding how to make minority group members really feel included within the organizations. And as we know, there's been a lot of different types of interventions, including affirmative action policies or diversity trainings, but there's huge debate about the efficacy of these initiatives. Simply that they don't work, sometimes they receive a lot of backlash, and unfortunately, it really doesn't help with the inclusion problem that we see in terms of within organizations. So we started taking from the customer service literature, actually, this idea of authenticity climates and saying, hey, how does that affect the experience of minority employees, namely African-American employees, in their ability to build a sense of positive identity? And I've had a lot of fun interviewing, actually doing a lot of interviews to see how Black employees actually positively affirm their identities. I had some individuals talk about, how they wear their hair naturally, kind of in line with the work by Tracy Dumas and Ashley Rosette, African-American women's, having the Afro hair, natural hair. Or another person that we interviewed started talking about how she watched Scandal or How to Get Away with Murder, these Black-oriented shows, in order to really give a perspective of the Black community, of their identity. So what we've seen is that authenticity climates do, in fact, improve these positive affirmations, but also that perspective taking is an additional tool that African Americans can use in order to really understand their climate, understand how to respond to that authenticity climate, and really become more involved in the organization because they're able to share aspects of their social identity. So these are just a couple things that I think I just want to spark some conversation about how we can overcome the limits of responsive action, really focusing on these climates, understanding the perspective of minorities, but also understanding how discourse can really influence whether people buy into certain policies for change. All right, on that note, I'm gonna hand it off to Robert. We're gonna start talking about how practice and research can help future work, inform future work.
Yeah, thank you, Cynthia, and everybody. Welcome, good morning, or good afternoon, good evening. So I'm Robert Wilken. I'm Professor of International Marketing at ESCP Business School. I'm based in Berlin in Germany, so it's approaching 5 p.m. I'm happy to have been invited to contribute to this very interesting and important conversation. So I'm the first one talking in this third section, advancing research and practice. And actually, the core question is, what can we contribute now to this discussion? We as professors, being researchers and also teachers, I'm very often I ask myself, where can I have the biggest impact? And very often the answer is in the classroom, where I can combine research and teaching. And Cynthia has already started with talking about this. The intersection. I'm going to continue with it. So my idea originates from a research project I started about 10 years ago. So during my time as a doctoral student, I worked on a project about sales negotiations on the side. And when I got the chair of international marketing at ESCP, I wanted to continue using the knowledge I had acquired in that area. So I came up with the idea of studying intercultural negotiations. And the context of ESCP was ideal for this. Why? Because it's a transnational university where students are required to study at several of our 6 campuses and thus also gain intercultural experience in addition to content-related training. And in our admission tests, we repeatedly emphasized that cooperation in multicultural teams is beneficial. So something that also Sonja emphasized from a practical point of view. Applied to my research, we studied which teams performed better in negotiation simulations, and they were fortunately the cross-culturally mixed teams in contrast to the monocultural teams. So interestingly, the advantageousness of mixed teams was not due to any particular negotiation strategy. So rather the cross-culturally mixed teams found different ways to achieve good results depending on their backgrounds. And these results were an incentive for me to continue research in this direction. A current project is shedding light on how the use of foreign language affects negotiation processes and outcomes. After all, many commercial intercultural negotiations take place in English between non-native speakers. Initial results are somewhat disappointing. So this time it's bad news somehow, that they show that particularly good foreign language skills are exploited unilaterally. So for me, this is a clear sign that our teaching simulations that we use in teaching need to focus much more on common and long-term goals. There is far too much focus on the economic output of one-off transactions. So consequently, we should set out to develop case studies in which students can practice building business relationships in which a broader set of goals is at stake. And one related idea I would like to share with you, I recently came across are so-called reflective notes. So these are activities that systematically make students critically think about what they do and how, and what they could do better and how. So citing a paper from Papenfuss and colleagues, so much sustainability education today is still delivered using transmissive and instrumental pedagogies, yet more clarity is needed about what will transform and emancipate students. So we should make students go beyond the question, what should I learn? And add the questions, what can we learn? How might I see the world? What can we become? So only if we equip students with the right tools will they apply such an approach based on cooperation and values of sustainability in their future careers. So much for my initial input to this discussion. And then I hand over to a trio of Michael, Laura, and Wendy.
Thank you, Robert. I want to thank Shirley and Poonam and Joshua for organizing this session and for including me and inviting me to be a part of it. And I'm happy to have Laura and Wendy as my in tandem co-presenters. We're going to talk a little bit in advancing research and practice. We're going to take different parts talking about restorative justice. I'm going to sort of give you some general frameworks and ideas for that. And then Laura's going to talk more specifically about transgressions and anger and in a context, a more specific context. And Wendy's going to talk in a more cultural context about restorative justice. What we like about restorative justice is that it addresses the macro, meso, and micro aspects of wicked problems, gives a foundation for healing and collaboration and planning and learning, which Joshua talked about. And it helps address some of the complex system aspects that Joshua talked about and the agility aspect that Sonia and Cindy talked about a little bit too. Because restorative justice helps expand perceptions of what is understood and what is possible. And we think this makes a great foundation for addressing these issues. Restorative justice, and this is borrowing from Gregory Paul, who I saw earlier in our session, I'm not sure if he's still here now, where restorative justice brings together the victim, the offender, and the community, using specifically facilitated dialogue, which emphasizes the repair of material, emotional, and relational harm by offending parties. So in a lot of the examples that have already been talked about today, there is material, emotional, and relational harm. So restorative justice helps to resolve this. And we think this is key to addressing both the complexity and the complications of restorative of wicked problems. Restorative justice helps also focus on the well-being of the relevant stakeholders, where victims are encouraged to express their concerns and offenders are encouraged to make amends. It's an ethos and set of practices that engender compassion and temperance among organizational members, and it helps to have a greater sense of belonging and inclusion for those who are involved or who are important constituents. Restorative justice also helps reintegrate offenders into a community. So this really allows for reconciliation in the sense of with a lack of embarrassment or retribution. So you can come back into the group without a sense of embarrassment and retribution. We think this is key to being a foundational idea or conceptual place for addressing a wicked problem. It helps to restore positive relationships. It brings things to a more positive relationship. So we were talking, I had mentioned earlier about the meso or the macro, meso, and micro sort of dyadic perspectives. On an individual level or dyadic level, restorative justice supports the development of psychological and communication aspects through mindful reflexivity. It engenders connection and belonging to groups and teams through relational practice. It helps improve people's skills in terms of their ability to relate and create connections between people. And at a more organizational level, it helps reform inequitable and discriminatory practices and policies, and to unlevel power structures that cause distress and harm to marginalized classes of people. So restorative justice also incorporates principles of equality, peace, recognition, healing, growth, and holism. And some scholars have argued that restorative justice is more effective at addressing personal and relational dynamics of conflict. So there's this nice restorative justice conflict link. Where some of that occurs has to do from minor aggressions at work to organizational violence, common related transgressions such as the betrayal of confidential information, damaged identity, interpersonal indignities, being lied to or manipulated for other people's gain. So restorative justice confidently is important because it helps us understand how to restore equilibrium in relationships. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Laura, who's going to give us a more specific context for some of these principles and some of these ideas, where restorative justice can help foster understanding, forgiveness, and acceptance of responsibility. So, Laura, it's all yours.
Thanks, Michael. And I have to say, I was taking notes on what everybody was saying because I think it's really related to Michael and Wendy and my area of restorative justice here. And if, for those of you who know me, you know that for me, everything, I see emotions in everything. To me, everything starts with emotions and ends with emotions. And one that I've been seeing a lot and that I've studied some is anger, in the particular context of EDII work. And so it's equity, diversity, inclusion. And here in Canada, we actually have the second I, which is indigenization. And if you've been following a lot of the news, not just with business schools, but also universities more broadly in the US and in Canada, it's been a massive issue that's gotten increasingly sort of big in the past year or 2 years or so. You may have experienced this at your own institutions, in fact. And so 3 points that I just wanted to say quickly about that, because I certainly don't have any answers for that. I know my school as well has been dealing with this and trying desperately to make things better. But the first one, I think it goes back to actually the very initial part of this session, is that it feels that a lot of the struggle has often been that we're treating it like a complicated problem and not a complex problem. And so many institutions are developing strategic plans and having task forces and all of these things that are trying to solve a problem. And already you actually see, I think, some of the issue in that and some of the tension and even anger that you see even within some of these task forces of disagreeing about what even the fundamental problem is. There was a lot of disagreement, for example, should we treat it more like a theory X or a theory Y problem? You know, should we focus on punishment and getting people in line and on board with different changes versus how do we enable people to be more open and to enable these aspects of EDII that we all have in our mission statements and this kind of thing. The second point also, I think, is something that Matt actually brought up that I think is really a critical piece here, is that there's a lot of focus on being the judge. What is a good policy? What isn't a good policy? How do we get people on board? You know, you haven't reacted well to this, or I've actually seen a lot in many different institutions, people getting very angry about misuse of terms. You know, when people are trying to learn how to refer to something in the proper way, somebody might say something, and I've made this mistake myself, I'll fully admit that. And then somebody, you know, jumps on and no, this isn't the right way to express it, which kind of gets it more of a superficial, in a sense, tension between people, rather than, you know, focusing on that underlying complex problem, rather than the complicated implementation of that. So more focus on that scientist aspect would be really critical here. And the third piece, and this gets back to anger, which I think is kind of a pretty cool emotion. I don't consider myself a super angry person, but I really enjoy studying it. And actually Ray Friedman is on the call, and he and I have had some work recently looking at in a sense, the cognitive benefits of anger as a form of information. And that is one big area that I wish I knew the answer of how to help many institutions get better at this, is that we're reactive often to the anger rather than saying, this is actually a critical piece of information about what's happening, what's wrong, and how we can make that better in a more scientific and less judgmental way that might actually help us take a few steps forward on the complex problem. So I'll leave it there because I think I'm actually getting close to time, but EDII is becoming increasingly interesting. I've got some ongoing work as well, looking at stereotypes and the effects of that, particularly ambivalence about stereotypes as we sort of try to start moving from, you know, one side to the other on building out that EDII initiative at many of our institutions. So with that, I'll turn it over to Wendy, who I think has some pretty exciting work on an even more specific, but really, really critical piece of restorative justice, I think specifically in the Canadian system.
Thank you, Laura. I wanted to start out by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from Kitchener, Ontario. I'm from the psychology department at University of Waterloo. And I have the privilege of both working and living and even owning land that was the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral peoples. This land was originally inhabited by them and promised to them in the Haldeman Tract. So it's land, almost 1 million acres of land on either side of the Grand River in Southwest Ontario that was promised to these Indigenous groups in a treaty in 1784. Today, these peoples live on reservation in the Six Nations Reservation and have only 48,000 acres of land that belongs to them. And so that land acknowledgement is something to give a bit of context to what I'm going to talk to you about, which is Indigenous employees' experiences when they are working in, you know, mainstream Canadian, North American, Western European organizations that have, you know, very different sets of values and workplace norms than traditional Indigenous cultures would have. And so in particular, we've been working on a project looking at how Indigenous employees would prefer to manage conflict within the workplace. And just to sort of tell you how this is a wicked problem, from the perspective of Indigenous, oh, and I should clarify that Indigenous refers to any First Peoples that inhabited a land before colonial settlers came in and took over, and in most cases tried to eradicate the culture and the peoples who were original inhabitants. So really for Indigenous employees, I argue that any conflict management is restorative justice. It has to be addressed with restorative justice because it happens within the context of the past and current injustices against Indigenous peoples. And this argument applies to really a lot of, if not all, minority groups, underrepresented, racialized, oppressed groups within our societies. So Indigenous employees exist within the context of the cultural genocide I just mentioned, their children being taken away in the past to residential schools, which everyone is now hearing about, you know, presently into foster care and the school to prison pipeline. So basically, Indigenous employees that we're talking to who have been, you know, fortunate enough to go to post-secondary and graduate and have a job in a mainstream Canadian organization, you know, they are still surrounded by family members and community members who may not have been so unfortunate. So this isn't something just in the past for them. So we argue that workplace conflict can't be seen simply through the Western lens of integrating interests of the parties sitting at the table, because for Indigenous employees, there's an entire history of injustices sitting at the table with them, and it's not something that we can ignore or pretend don't exist. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of how this is a wicked problem, because it's poorly understood and addressed in the existing conflict management literature. Socially complex, continuously evolving, particularly as Indigenous peoples begin to heal and reclaim their identity, as Indigenous nations begin to reclaim land and economic sovereignty, and with social movements that people have been referencing throughout our introductions, and calls for real EDI actions in the workplace. So the study I'll briefly tell you about, we surveyed 36 and talked to 36 Indigenous post-secondary alumni from Southwest Ontario. We talked to them about their conflict management preferences at work. So we didn't ask them about their actual experiences because of the inherent power differentials and cultural dynamics. They may not be able to use their preferred ways of managing conflict in the workplace. So we asked about their preferred ways, how in ideal situations, ideal workplace, how would they want to manage conflict? And we asked about their preferences for all the dual concern model approaches, as well as something called holistic conflict management. I'm working on with Leanne Liu, that construct that's based in dialectical thinking and high context communication, holistic perspectives, and relationality. And so we did find that Indigenous employees, they definitely express preferences for integrating, also compromise from the dual concern model, and then also this kind of holistic conflict resolution, which I wanted to just share a couple items from that scale so you can see how it is related to restorative justice approaches. So some of the items are to act based on what would be best for everyone around me, what would be best for my community, continue resolving the conflict until I feel comfortable with all the other parties once more. Think about the broader context beyond the people directly involved in the conflict. Think about how the conflict fits into the grand scheme of things. So that kind of gives you an idea. We also found from our open-ended interview questions that Indigenous employees preferred conflict to be managed directly, in that the disputants would be talking to one another, but that there would be a third party involved. And this is reminiscent of Indigenous approaches to conflict management, which are really community-based, and typically there is an elder or some sort of a mediator there to help resolve the conflict. So hopefully I didn't go over my 3 minutes. Can't remember if I'm supposed to propose my seed question here, but my seed question is, how can we reorient our approaches to conflict management to address the lived experiences and workplace realities of racialized minority group members? And how can we as researchers, academics, and practitioners bring these voices to the table? So thanks for letting me share that. I'm excited to be here. And with that, I will pass it over to Modi.
Thank you, Wendy.
Modi, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Thank you.
Go.
Well, I didn't say important things so far. Thank you for the trio and for this very interesting presentation, which actually gave me start of answer to something that bothers me since the beginning of our session. I'm not an English speaker. I mean, like, that's not my mother tongue. And when I saw the title "Wicked Problems," I tried to look for the dictionary. What is the meaning of wicked? And wicked is, evil, poison. And I'm asking myself, as someone who deals all the time with very complex issues, why you choose to attribute something which has a negative connotation to something which is beautiful, the complexity. Look at Josh's presentation at the beginning. It's exciting, the complexity. And today, under the, after the year that COVID really threw all our realities apart, the understanding that we live in a VUCA world, and that's a term which is fascinating to introduce. The VUCA, which stands from volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguity. That is something which is so distant from the wicked issue. So for me, as a practitioner, as a negotiating, talking with you just before dinner from Tel Aviv, the concept of complexity and the need to address this uncertain, dynamic, completely unpredictable development in negotiation processes, in social challenges, for me, the immediate, I would say, scholarly request is to go back and challenge some of the basic assumptions that we as negotiators, as negotiation scholars are dealing with. For example, the need to sign stable agreement. Why? Why we should look for stable agreement when reality is so dynamic? Why I should, and this is, by the way, what I definitely advise my clients, why shouldn't we sign an agreement for 6 months, and then we will review, or we will enter into continuous negotiation to modify or to extend? For example, the concept of trust. And this is something that I, coming from the place that I'm coming and dealing intensively in the last 2 years with cyber criminals, negotiating ransomware and cyber extortion, the concept of trust, I'm faced with this question all the time. How can you transfer Bitcoin? Yes, my American colleagues, I'm, might be falling into OFAC terminology of facilitating payment of ransom, but I'm not doing directly, so I'm fine with that. Executive whose all their businesses are held for ransom for 5 million, 10 million US dollars, and I managed to reduce the price 50% and to pay only 2 million, and they asked me, how can you trust them? I said, well, I don't trust them. I understand their business logic. I understand their commercial interest. And I definitely developed, through the last 7 days of negotiating with them, I developed respect. And yes, I don't trust the cyber criminals, but the same that I don't trust Hamas, or I don't trust, I don't deal with family law, but the same as in divorce, they don't trust each other, but we do trust a process that we managed to build together. And we do trust and we do respect each other rather than trusting. I think that for us as scholars, the need, as a result of being in a complex world, the need to challenge some of the core concepts that we developed, all the books that are behind my back, behind Sonia's back, and Johan and all of us, we should challenge some of the basic assumptions of the foundation of negotiation theory. Culture, for example, we say, yes, there is an international language of negotiation, there is a global culture of negotiation, and working 10 years in Russia, I'll tell you, really? What is the international culture of negotiation in a culture that in its language, the word power does not exist? In Russian language, we have 2 words, one for force, sila, which is the most common, and the second is vlast, which means authority. So how can actually you speak, in my work in Russia, when I speak about negotiation power, which party has more power at the negotiation table, the put translators needs to use the word like energy, something like this, to describe. So, developing all, to cut the long story short, and by the end of my 3.5 minutes Middle East time, I would argue that I think that I would not use the word wicked, because I don't want to associate the challenges that Josh so beautifully framed at the beginning, the challenges of complexity. I don't want to frame it in a negative emotion. I would like to frame it as an exciting, challenging, and the challenge is to go back to our basic concepts, which all the negotiation literature is based on, and challenge them and review them, understanding the principles of VUCA, of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And halas, with that, I hand over to my good friend Amira, whose most challenging task in the next year will be to persuade me to complete finally my PhD. And my answer to her is, I've been writing my PhD and it's present progressive in English, but it never makes any progress. Amira, to you, please.
Thank you, Moti. Hi, everyone. My name is Amira Sharif, and I'm a professor in the conflict management and negotiation program in Bar-Ilan University in Israel. And in my talk, I am going to address some of the arguments that Moti just raised. I would like to address the wicked problem of a low trust environment in negotiations which take place in intractable conflicts, and to suggest that in cases where the parties don't trust each other, the engagement of a trustworthy and a skillful third-party mediator will be essential for reaching an agreement. In these cases, the third party should focus on cultivating what Moti notes in his last paper as the parties' trust in the process, which means turning the parties' focus on the process as a joint achievement. As you all know, negotiation literature often views trust in the other party as a key element for reaching an agreement in negotiations. Yet, very often, negotiations conducted in intractable conflicts, and especially in crisis situations in these conflicts, are conducted against the backdrop of deep mistrust, in which the strategies that the parties apply during negotiations and on the ground are still dictated by the parties' fears that the other will exploit their weaknesses. I argue that though trust in the other party to a negotiation is a highly desirable feature, it might not be a necessary condition for agreement to be reached in negotiations in the context of intractable conflicts. Instead, drawing on Moti's argument for the necessity of trusting the process for reaching an agreement in cases of low trust environment, in cases where the parties don't trust each other, the engagement of a third-party mediator will be essential. In these cases, an effective third party should focus on facilitating the parties' perceptions of a way out and the mutually enticing opportunity. Now, the question is, how can a third party focus the parties' attention on the process in situations in which mistrust prevails? Well, some initial thoughts on effective third-party involvement in such situation can be derived from an analysis of the tasks applied by UN peace envoy Nikolai Mladinov in mediating the ceasefire understandings between Israel and Hamas in 2018. While Israel and Hamas refused to recognize each other and had no direct contact, in his engagement, Mladinov managed to focus the parties on the benefits of the process. Several features underline Mladinov's effective third-party engagement in this case, and these included the third party's reputation as a trustworthy, perceptive, and capable mediator, third party pursuing different tasks and deploying a variety of strengths that made both parties realize the benefits of the negotiation process, and the third party's show of even-handedness. The different tasks and strengths Mladinov pursued included formulating a roadmap for the transformation of the conflict, facilitating dialogue between the parties, creating a new narrative around which the conflict could be managed, convincing the parties of the feasibility of the deal, and creatively bridging the parties' demand by changing their motives and explaining the benefits of agreement. This case demonstrates how a third party can open up alternatives for the parties who are locked into an adversarial mode of thought, as the third party skillfully walks them throughout the risky circumstances and toward trusting the process. Thank you. Shirley, I'm passing it on to you.
Yeah, thank you, Amira, and thank you, everyone who's spoken thus far. Sarah Wheeler-Smith was going to speak on organizational justice and ethics, and unfortunately had to leave. And Poonam wasn't able to join us, even though this was kind of a brainchild of our imagination, and we're so excited. We're actually recording so that she can participate following the session, at least, and viewing what we did. Poonam was going to speak about contextual uncertainty, and I was going to speak about decision-making logics at this point, kind of transitioning us to an integrative discussion and brainstorming. And so I'll just say a few words about the things I've been thinking about for the last few decades by now. But it started with research very much grounded in social dilemmas and the conflict that exists between what's rational for an individual and what's rational for the collective, because that for me was a really interesting point in research that connected to the real world problems that inspired me to go pursue a PhD. And I remember my initial conversations with Dave Messick about social motives, and his introducing me to this place of this kind of point of research that was just so intriguing to me at the time. And so the work I've done empirically and conceptually, ironically, took me away from the conflict between what's rational for the individual and what's rational to the group, to questioning the logic of rationality altogether, and doing a lot of kind of conceptual development of ideas around a logic of appropriateness. Given my other side of empirical research on culture, these connected in a really elegant way to say a logic of appropriateness is actually culturally informed, and captures behavior in complex situations where a person, we might be able to understand what they do, not by asking what's rational, but by asking, what does a person like me do in a situation like this, given the group culture? So 4 factors: identity, the rules, the situation, how it's recognized, and the culture. And I think this ties together beautifully some of the things we've heard around the table today. I also had the incredible honor of learning about the work of Anatol Rapoport, much beyond what I studied in economics and game theory initially, which might be the surface of his work that many people are familiar with. But his papers on the use and misuse of game theory, I think, opened the door and connected to his work on semantics, and how we heard from Moti, and from other people about language like Robert, and from Wendy, what is the language? It connects to what are the logics, and the importance of not constraining how we frame problems and available solution sets, given the logics and the perspectives that we use and are used to as a lens to view what's going on around us. And so with this notion of it's not constrained to an agreement, it's an ongoing conversation, I'd like to say that this roundtable was imagined as a possibility for us in IACM to really start talking about wicked problems, and we may have to rename them, and we can talk about that. But at this point, I'd like to open it up and see if anybody has questions, whether you're on the roundtable or a participant. The floor is open, and we're looking for questions that would be integrative and would help us brainstorm about how to move forward. The room is open and available to us, so we do not have to end at 11:20, but whenever we end the conversation today on Zoom, it's really just a beginning. So with that, I'll transfer to whoever it is who would like to speak. Jose.
Hi, Siri. Hi, colleagues. A great panel, super interesting, many ideas. The juices are flowing. So that's great. And I followed all of your presentations. So thank you for the input. And I had so much to jot down. And just a couple of maybe ideas going back to it in terms of construing something around the term wicked might be something to look into it again, to maybe deconstruct the term. It is not really something new. The army has played around with it already in the Vietnam War. Engineering has played around with it in the 70s. We have to maybe look at it how it arrived now in the 21st century and how it makes sense to still look at it from that perspective. And the second thing of the three things I'm going to say is the temporal aspect. There are certain temporal overlaps, and the knowledge framing around that is also temporal. What one group may see as wicked, another one has been already going on to machinery or finding small solutions. So the temporal aspect is something I've not seen as well coming out. Maybe it's there somewhere. It's maybe salient throughout all the contributions, but I'm wondering about the temporal aspect, because you have the whole structural complexity. All the cultures don't move at the same speed. I think Wendy alluded to that a little bit. And also there's the knowledge framing around that, looking at indigenous knowledge, looking at the more constructivist knowledge. So how do we make sense of these and how do we bring it together? A final factor is at some points, it's not about finding a total solution, because once you frame it as wicked, you always go for a binary, wicked or tame. And the world doesn't work in wicked or tame. There are a range of wickedness layers that work all around the same time. So how do we appreciate that without having to jump? I know the business world is asking for it, and I come from international relations environment, so you also want to have quick solutions and quick fixes, but that's not how it works. So how do we make sure that the small wins that sometimes do not, or that are invisible, or the story is not told because we don't see it, because we look at the wicked, but we don't see it, the small wins, the slow cooking progress that's being made, and how do we make sure that improvements that have been made are part of the solution and not just another, oh, well, they have to be part and parcel of it. So I was wondering about these things, the bias in terms of how we frame the problems, the temporal aspect of it, in terms of knowledge fragmentation and the different speeds and how to function and operate. And then the last thing, of course, is looking at how do you make sure that small wins, improvements are seen as well in terms of this binary discussion, because it's not just wicked or tame. Thank you very much.
Could I address one point of that? I mean, I think that the thing that I just wanted to talk about was the speed at which change happens. There is a narrative about every inventions being immediately seen and understood for what their value is of any sort, and that's never ever true. Yet it is what we sort of teach that. And so my favorite example of this is the invention that enabled the transistor, probably the most important technological change of our lifetime. The invention that started that came 115 years beforehand. And I don't think the inventors of the transistor imagined what that would do. So going back to one of the earlier presentations about what we do as educators and scientists, I really feel like we have a responsibility to say to people, no, I know you want to believe that, but that's just not what the data support, right? I mean, Cynthia's presentation about when, lots of people are out there selling all kinds of stuff to reduce bias and do all sorts of other wonderful things, and they don't work. And after somebody had an idea, it seemed like a good practice, people made companies, went out and tried to sell it. We didn't step back and say, hey, that doesn't work, right? So that's, I feel like, our responsibility as researchers and scientists to step up and say, that's bullshit, right? The trust fall isn't going to help. So let's knock it off. So just my 2 cents.
I think Jeffrey's got his hand raised.
Maybe I should just go ahead. Okay. This is very stimulating, everyone. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. For me, it's morning, so it's a good way to wake up and get the brain juices flowing, so to speak. Making a lot of connections, trying to get into the artist mindset Matt was mentioning. Not yet in a position where I feel like I have anything worth raising, but maybe a question for anyone who wants to jump at it. You know, I think about these different kinds of wicked problems, and you know, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are really an amazing embodiment of what I consider to be many of these wicked problems. Then I think about too, and so I think that's like an amazing direction that I want to keep thinking. Then I think about too some of the internal conflicts that I've observed. You know, while I'm in Canada, I mean, I think I've seen most of this happening in the States that I want to reference right now, which is, you know, this resistance to critical race theory, or the notion of discussing race as a part of the American history in many US states that are going on right now, where it seems to be ideological. And, you know, I think about, and I think there are some amazing tools that were raised in this discussion, things like taking the perspective of the minority, as Cindy mentioned, you know, reducing the requirement of trust, as Amira mentioned. I mean, I can keep going. There's so many great ideas. One of the things I'm struggling with in that context is this notion of, well, is it ideology? Is there a way to move past this difference in ideology that we're observing there? And is that something that we can treat as a wicked problem, or just an irreconcilable conflict? So I'd like to get folks' thoughts on that.
Does anyone from the panel, from the roundtable, or from the audience want to build on that? If not, I see Godfrey has his hand up also. And I think we're going to officially thank everyone, because the next person will probably speak for more than 1 minute. And so if you have to leave at 11:30 sharp, we understand, and we thank you for joining. And we know we're going to continue to talk in person, hopefully in a hotel lobby or on a beach when we all get together for what we remember as IACM. And it's amazing that we can do what we're doing here now. So if you would like to answer, unmute yourself.
Jeffrey, maybe you and I can talk offline a little bit more. I know that it seems like things have gotten worse in the US, and there's some research that points to that, unfortunately, but we can talk a little bit more about that another
Sounds
time.
good.
Yeah.
Sure.
Godfrey, do you want to raise another idea?
Thank you, everyone. I'm Godfrey Steele. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. I've been involved with IACM since 2003. My first experience was in Melbourne, Australia. No, actually, it was in France as a participant back in 2002. And then my first actual presentation was in Melbourne. I'm interested in the contribution of underrepresented samples and perspectives in the scholarship, research, and publication output relevant to this topic. For example, William has talked to us about the complexity multiplying role of COVID-19. And other colleagues have spoken to linguistic and other perspectives, discourse, and that kind of thing. I'm sorry about this, yes. So I'm wondering, how can we bring perspectives into our research and our discussion that allows us to go beyond some of the hegemonies that exist in the research that we have. And by hegemony, I'm not saying that the dominant perspectives and the dominant research findings that are present are a bad thing in themselves. But I'm saying if they're the only things, then we need to make space for other perspectives that you can get from a small island state, for example, where I live and work. Take, for example, our handling of COVID-19 would have been very different to the way it was handled in a larger continental space. We can manage, or we're able to manage, entry into and out of our borders in a way that is different if you are part of a large landmass. So I'm saying sometimes you can get a micro perspective, and sometimes you can look to see how that micro perspective interacts with the macro perspective. I'm suggesting that if we are going to advance our work in this area, we need to build it into our research agendas. We need to make sure that there's representation in a way that doesn't overstate the case for inclusion of minorities, but also doesn't undervalue the work of what has already been achieved in cultures and societies which have had a lot more of a head start in doing some of this work. So I'm simply ending by saying that this is something that we may want to consider broadening the scope. And I'm aware of discussions of a similar nature. I'm a member of NCA, National Communication Association. I belong to other groups. And there are also parallel diversity, equity, and inclusion discussions taking place. So essentially, how do we ensure that our samples and our perspectives that are unrepresented or underrepresented become part of the discussion in order to ensure that we have both micro and macro global perspectives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Godfrey. I think a lot of people had to leave exactly on time. And so rather than answering this, perhaps anyone who from the audience who has any thoughts that haven't been raised, it'd be just great for us to hear from you if you can stay for a few more minutes. Johan, any thoughts? Sylvia, Chris, Deva? I don't know if people are there.
Oh, Godfrey, for me, I've been trying to do more multicultural projects because obviously you bring up a very important point. So what I like about IACM is it allows for these discussions and collaborations. So I guess simply put is hopefully these conversations can spark interactions that allows for more global understanding and kind of more focus on underrepresented groups and underrepresented countries in terms of research and practice.
Thank you.
People are leaving, Shirley.
I know.
Yeah.
I think
this is fine. No,
I think this was great.
I think. Thank you, Josh.
I know.
And Shirley
I'm glad
and
you
Amira.
guys could stay so we could hear at least one more. Josh, any brilliant thoughts now that it's over? So we're officially done. This is the hangout.
But it's officially done.
I think no, unless you want to say something that's being recorded. So we're done, I think, because we're Amira, thank you.
Amira, thanks. Oh, we can't hear you. I think you're muted.
I said, thank you, Shirley.
Oh, great.
Also, I guess we'll be hearing the record, so the recording, so in any event.
The only thing I was going to say, I don't know if you can see this.
Yeah, we could see it.
But just that question that Pascal raised about the temporal aspect, you know, we think about these problems in sort of along a timeline, but really I work a lot in ecosystems and ecosystem management and in the natural resource and environmental systems literature and just way of operating the world. We think about cycles of systems and how they go through cycles of disturbance and consolidation and conservation and collapse. And so we start at a lot of resources being sort of available, but patterns not really established here. And as more sunlight or more finance or whatever it is available, patterns start to emerge, and we see the system take sort of a dominant like structure in this K phase, the conservation phase, but change is always happening. And so we hit this inflection point where the institutions or the informal arrangements among stakeholders become maladapted to the actual context. And so we go through this collapse process. And in that collapse process, the structures, the patterns sort of break apart, and all those resources are released back into the system so they're available to take on either the same shape or new shapes. And so as we move into the reorganization phase, the question is, how can we manage that to create patterns or institutions that are better adapted to more people, more stakeholders' needs? And that has to be a deliberative process. But so moving from like problem solution to cycles of tension, pattern emergence, collapse, and reorganization is a really useful way, I think, of engaging with these sorts of problems. Particularly, Modi's question about like the etymology, like, yeah, wicked problems, horrible framing because it's got this negative connotation, but thinking about the etymology, like wicked comes from Wicca, comes from the use of sorcery to create illusion or false things. And so if we're like 5 different stakeholders all talking about a complex issue, any way that I frame it is going to be false to you. It's going to totally marginalize you, dismiss your identity, dismiss your needs, everything. And so the problem itself, the way I frame it, is false, hence wicked. And so understanding it from that context, it's like, all right, how can we reduce the falsehood or expand the voices and perspectives included in the problem framing to sort of reimagine what's possible? And that opens up the creativity, and it requires that restorative justice lens to really enable us to humanize each other and listen and include your needs, interests, etc. in the problem space. That's my 2 cents. Done.
That's really helpful. And the visual is really helpful. It's really neat.
Yeah. Thank you.
Chris, are you there? Chris Honeyman? I know sometimes people leave the Zoom on and go and get coffee for the next session. So I would just love to hear his thoughts, but Cindy, Amir, anything else? Final words?
No, do you need me?
No, thank you. Go, it's dinner time. Go get your dinner. Thanks, and we'll all be in touch. And this was really wonderful.
Great, good to see you, everybody.
Bye.
Good to see you. Bye.